Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Welcome, dear friends, to Kardec Radio and our Health and Spirituality program. That's how we began 9 years ago. We're going to turn 10 years in 2021, and we are here with our 11 a.m. programs, talking to experts in the fields of things that interest to us. Today, we're going to talk about life and death. How do we transition? How do we deal with it? Are you ready for this? Because it's going to happen to us, to our loved ones, and we are at a time, it's the pandemic. Yes. Some people think it's just the media frenzy. Sorry to say, but I've had relatives and also friends who've discarnated because of the coronavirus. And it's not a media frenzy. It's real. We need to pay attention. We need to care. And for us, we're here and know about life continuum. There is much to learn. And today we have a very special program. If last week, Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. was here with us. Today, a friend of his, a collaborator of his is here with us. I've come to know of the beautiful works of Lisa Smartt, and she has much to tell us. She's a linguist. She's a poet. She's a researcher as well. And she comes to share something that I bet you haven't heard before. It's words at the threshold. It's what people talk about when they're dying. What does happen? You may have experienced it at deathbed of your loved ones or not, but this will come. How do we teach our children to deal with it? Recently, my father discarnated as well. My daughter was on my side when this happened, when I got to know through the phone. What should I say? What it is, as natural as it is. Your grandpa is going back to the spiritual home. That's all it is. How do we deal with it? We're going to talk about it. Should we talk about it? Should we listen? Should we just dismiss? Or how do we do it? At this time of the pandemic, I just want to give you some numbers. I know you may say, I read the news. I don't care anymore. No, we care. If we talk about the United States alone, according to the CDC, if you go to the website of covid.cdc.gov, researchers need to be trusted because it's hard work. And this website is reliable. It may be even more than what it is, but what's being reported is 16, almost 17 million people have been infected. More than 309,000 deaths have happened in the United States alone. Vaccines are coming up. But life is here and it goes on. But how do we deal with this transition? No matter if we know life goes on, it's about saying goodbye temporarily. But how do we do it? Should we do something special? Let's bring here Lisa Smartt, who has written a book that we all should read. First, because it's so easy to read, so well written. Plus, it brings, and I'll read just as a teaser for us, the very foreword in the words of Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. The first paragraph. Words at the threshold marks a new era in the understanding of the process of dying. Lisa Smartt's work has profound psychological, spiritual, and clinical implications for the care of terminally ill patients and their families. And I believe that her work also opens unexplored pathways for the genuinely rational investigation of humankind's deepest mystery, the prospect of life after death. These are the words of a a renowned researcher, the father of near-death experiences, Dr. Raymond Moody Jr., in the very foreword of this book. I won't say anymore because we want to welcome together Lisa Smartt. Thank you, Lisa, for being with us here at Kardec Radio today. How are you?
I'm well. It's good to be here. And, as you talk about the statistics with coronavirus, I personally am very blessed to be doing well, but my heart goes out to so many people whose lives are being touched by it directly. And we're all being touched. I mean, it's sort of as I'm in a position where my life is pretty good right now, but I'm completely isolating because I'm afraid. But my heart goes out to anyone who's been directly or indirectly affected by coronavirus today.
Yes, you're right. And our lives are being reshaped by the current epidemic, right?
Yeah.
And death is just in our face. Every day we hear a friend, a relative, somebody telling, passed away, is in the hospital. So more than ever, at least at our time, death is right there. If we are not in the battlefields of any war, now there is this invisible or microscopic war that is really teasing us to think about what is it about life. And I know, Lisa, you've been a linguist and a poet, and you've started researching this, and the book tells us when your father was transitioning. Would you like to tell us about it, please?
It was 2012, and at the time I was a teacher. I was an educator, and I was working with adults who had dyslexia, very intelligent, but had trouble reading and writing because of that. So that was how my linguistics was applied in my life, was trying to figure out the connection between people's, how they were processing language and what I know about language. So anyway, I was working and I got the call from my mother that my father very, very unexpectedly walked out the front door of the house in California on a cold January night in his underwear at midnight. And nothing, I mean, my father was he was a psychologist, a scientist, PhD. This was very, very, very uncharacteristic. He had never done anything like that, of course. And he landed up, when he was walking down the street, he was completely delirious. And when the police found him, he said, "I'm going to look for the big art exhibition. I'm bringing these boxes to my wife's art exhibition." And now looking back, I understand how those words made sense, that my father was announcing some kind of big event coming that was related to his life, because my mother was an artist. And indeed, a big event was coming that none of us had anticipated, because he was actually pretty well. But 3 weeks later, he did die from a very serious infection that he landed up not fighting. So while my father was dying, he was just saying things that were remarkable. And being a linguist, my ears perked up because I almost felt like I had entered another country. It was almost like another world, because some of the constructions and things I were hearing were not things I was accustomed to hearing. So just as I was taught to do with a foreign language, I began to write down everything he said. And that began this journey into people's final words that has taken me here today with you.
That's wonderful. And you know what's interesting? You know how challenging it is for people to talk about death, even if death is there in your face. Mm-hmm. People are afraid. And I remember reading this nurse's comment that you researched upon, saying, talking about death to people who are dying is not going to kill them.
Oh yeah, that was a great quote. Yeah, and looking back now, I regret some of the conversations I had with my father, because I was so afraid to bring up the reality of what was in front of me, just like you did today, talking about coronavirus, naming what is so. Many of us, including myself at the time, we don't want to say the words, because it's almost as if we speak them, we're going to make them happen. Yeah, that's
Yeah. And I remember, for example, Lisa, I usually don't talk about my personal life, but the spirit mentors at Kardec Radio said, this one you can say, because recently, September 11th, my father discarnated in Brazil. And I remember since January, when he started being very severely ill, talking to my family members saying, I know there is a pandemic, but if you guys give me the green light, I can go there and we can take a risk. I want to be. And some of my brothers were saying, but if you come, he's going to think he's dying because you're a medium. And I said, guys, but I saw that, just like you said, people don't want to talk about it. They think by talking about it, they attract it. It's as if death is attracted by talking about it. If it were so, the people who work with cadavers all the time, all day long, they would be dead by now, because that's their daily bread, right?
It's true. There's so much mystery in it for all of us. And then, with my father, when he started talking about angels, this is a man who is completely skeptical. My father, the idea of an angel, he would roll his eyes just at the word angel. He was so skeptical and so scientifically oriented. So when he started seeing angels, now looking back, I wish I had said to him, angels, what do they look like, Papa? And tell me more about what they're saying to you. And, I think the less we can fear death and what happens, I am convinced now there's a very powerful transition that occurs. And I don't know what it is. I can't say that I know exactly, but I know that it exists. And, what an opportunity for us when someone we love is dying to engage with them, one, to give them comfort. Because oftentimes people on some level know what's going on. They may not have the word for it, and that's one of the things in my research I talk about. And maybe for them, it doesn't really feel like what we think of as dying. For many of them, they may describe a trip or seeing beautiful colors in a room. So something was going on, and it's like denying the elephant in the room. But also, what a great opportunity for us, kind of selfishly, because we can have access to this dimension where our loved ones are going. And what's hard is when people are dying is, honestly, it is hard to look at, and from the physical sense, bodies dying is hard. It is hard. And, but if we can remember there's the spirit in there and some kind of deeper mystery, and the more we can imagine that is the truth, which I have come to believe it is. And if we can walk into the room where someone we love is dying with the sense of it being a sacred place, then we can keep our ears open for what we're hearing and maybe not be so afraid. One day my father said to me, when he was dying, he had this pencil. Mm-hmm. Remember, this was before I had done my research, so I had no idea. He had this pencil and he was putting it in his, kind of on his back. And he said, I'm trying to get the pencil to the other side. And of course, being a starter, I said, Daddy, give me that pencil. You're going to hurt yourself, because that was a natural impulse. But I didn't want my dad to hurt himself with the pencil. But now looking back, I wish I said, oh, the pencil wants to go to the other side. Tell me more about the other side. What's the other side, right? But at the other time, I wasn't thinking of another dimension or another place or, the afterlife. So really, as people are dying, there are so many opportunities for us to engage with our loved ones in deeper ways, and also to engage with, what I call source or spirit.
So last week, we were here talking to Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. about his books about making sense of nonsense. And you have brought to him this, your collaboration with him, because you've been working on trying to make sense of people's apparently nonsense. Right. And here comes what is not intelligible at deathbed, as you're saying, the pencil going to the other side. So what is the major message for people? There is a practical tip here for them. Instead of dismissing, what should people do?
There are, I think, several potential messages from what from the research that I've done and what I've seen. But to piggyback on Dr. Moody's research, Raymond looked at nonsense, and found that nonsense is a part of the human experience as, literal or sensical language, right? We see it everywhere. And he actually identified 70 different types of nonsense. And why his research was so important to me, and why I just was so inspired by his work, is that when we can get past what he calls the nonsense taboo, when we stop thinking like, oh my God, Grandpa just said something weird. It's the medicine, something, rather than like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what he means by that. I'm curious. And when you know that Raymond's opened the door to study nonsense as well as sensical language, one of the things he talks about is, you look at Dr. Seuss or Lewis Carroll, you look at books that have a foundation in nonsense, and they're selling millions of copies. So there's something in nonsense that is so essential to being human. So, and also one of the things Raymond talks about that I've seen is, it seems that as we shift dimensions, there's a connection between nonsense and the shifting of consciousness. And we also know that nonsense, like koans in Buddhism, the sound of one hand clapping, which is obviously nonsense, but it seems to have that effect. And monks for, years and years and years have known that many times nonsense offers us a chance to alter our state of consciousness. And in the same way, Raymond and I feel that when people are in an altered state of consciousness, their language reveals interesting kind of paradoxes. So, for example, and he may have mentioned this, but when people have near-death experiences, they come back and they speak in ways that are nonsensical. And what they may say is, I've never felt so alive as when I was dead. Now, that's a pure contradiction. That's total nonsense, right? But that's part of the other dimension, that the physical body is dead, but then there's this release of incredible aliveness. So we know that oftentimes when we hear paradoxical statements or people start speaking nonsense, oftentimes behind it, there's a more powerful and alternate reality besides, here's a cup of tea, which is literal language, right? No contradictions there. But when you start talking in terms of contradictions, so I would say to people, one of the many things that Raymond and I have learned, and I've learned, is that you're going to hear language that seems very contradictory and paradoxical as people are dying. And maybe instead of assuming Grandpa's crazy or it's the medications, you can maybe open your mind to the possibility that it's an expression of an alternate dimension, that it's the language of the other side.
It's so true. I mentioned a little bit about it to Dr. Raymond Moody about the fact that Kardec, he's named the codifier because he decoded the messages that were coming in through the mediums. So here we're talking about a decoding system as well. It's so interesting. And in his book in 1857, the Spirit's book, he talks about when we sleep and we have dreams and we bring memories that there is nonsense to, like me doing this there. And he explains, like, previous lives memories or spiritual experiences while your body is at sleep. But I'm here reminding myself that one day I called my parents. My father was very ill. And he asked my mom, who is on the phone? And she said, oh, Vanessa is on the phone. And then he said, tell her that I'm not going to go to Paris. And I'm like, I understood that he was, and my mom was like, oh, he's speaking things that don't make sense at all. And I said, Mom, he's more in the spiritual realm than here, because the things he's saying are about things that don't belong to this scenario now. But people don't know about it, right, Lisa? They don't.
No, and especially talking about other places, there's a wonderful book that talked about metaphors. It's called it's called Final Gifts, and it's 2 hospice nurses. And theirs was the only book that I could find that was similar in their interest in what happens as people, how people communicate at end of life. And they emphasize primarily the metaphoric aspect of end of life language. And what we hear so commonly, and they write about it, and I saw it clearly in my research, is people oftentimes talk about going to other places. And the one about Paris, he may have been telling you, I'm not quite ready to go yet. But, and my father, who was a gambler, he loved to gamble. So he started talking about the big trip to Las Vegas, And my mom was saying, honey, you're sick. We're not going to Las Vegas. And he was like, yes, we are, and I'm going to be lucky, right? I'm going to get lucky. But people start talking about trips. And, I've had several nurses and chaplains describe how they had patients who said they needed a passport. They needed their passport. And so, but if you don't know that kind of metaphor is common in bedrooms or hospital rooms all around the country, we hear this language in isolation. So your mother or you thought, oh, it's just our father or he's the crazy one talking about Paris, who knows? But really, when you do research, the power of research is you see things that you think are isolated cases actually appear, we know this about dream research, right? Other researchers, there are certain dreams or symbols. And so
So do you, I have a feeling when I was reading this book, your book, that maybe people will also be reading this to understand, to decode what they're experiencing with their loved ones. Did you get, because you published in 2017.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
People that came across your book trying to understand, what is my loved one saying?
It's I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I have heard anecdotally people say, oh, I'm so grateful I got your book before my father died, because instead of walking out the room shaking my head that he was on too many medications, I walked back into the room and sat next to him and was able to have some very fascinating, also oftentimes inspiring and touching conversations. And one example from the book is one woman who was a nurse, if I recall correctly, she, her mother stopped communicating. I mean, it almost was unresponsive. So she was just, I hate to put it this way, but, she would give her mother a few touches and then kind of just gave up on any kind of real contact between the two of them. And so she decided, after hearing about my book, to just sit with her in meditation, because I said, well, just imagine that she's, imagine that you're praying to her, like someone on the other side, as you would, a loved one who is already gone. Just communicate like you would to God, or, anyone you think of who's not in physical form. Just imagine. Mm-hmm. So she decided to try it one day, and she sat down at the bed next to her mother and just began to sort of, I love you, just kind of in her mind had these thoughts. And then when the nurse came in to see how the mother was, how everything was, the mother kind of very unexpectedly got up and said to the nurse, oh, everything's great. I'm having a wonderful conversation with my daughter. And the daughter was blown away, because she had never had any psychic experiences. She's not like you, a medium or anything. And she was blown away, because you're like, oh my God, there's some level of communication going on, even though there were no words spoken, right? So that also opened my mind. When I originally began this book, I didn't think I was going to do anything with telepathy or any of that kind of thing. But the more that I did the research, the more I heard from nurses. I was blown away by how many nurses out there are having psychic experiences with their patients before they go. And so we communicate in many more ways than I was originally taught as a linguist. That's for sure.
That's beautiful. And you also mentioned about the fact that they receive, or they say people are visiting them.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to talk about
that? I mean, that's, what's happened now. It is so well known that occurs, that even, WebMD, it's on the website, it's on the internet. It's a very mainstream website. Well, even there now, they discuss how when you start seeing relatives who had passed on before you, that's an indication that death is coming. So they even know how common. And there was so there are so many instances where people in my study would see, for example, one woman said to her daughter, "Oh my God, Earl," who is her ex-husband, "Earl is here." And then she would be like, yeah, kind of muttering and talking to Earl. But then she would turn to her daughter and said, "Oh, I feel so much better. He's come to take me." And so it's very common. There was one study by a doctor, Dr. Kerr, 500 people, and they found, I think it was almost 80% of their dying patients had some kind of visitation either in their dreams or at their bedside. And, when you start getting doctors who are doing research, and I think they were in Buffalo, reputable research like that, getting the same kind of findings as we did more informally, something's going on. Something's going on. My dad started talking. My dad, the skeptic, 3 days before he died, said, the angels tell me 3 days left, only 3 days. And guess what? 3 days later, my dad was gone. So obviously he was tapped into something.
Wow. It's amazing. And what is interesting here is that you have seen that there is a common, it's like a pattern that you have discovered from language, from different ways of communicating, from this altered state of the mind and expanded perception. For us, for those who are still here, dealing with it, many people think that death is very difficult. And there is a nurse, and I apologize because I marked it down and I can't find, I got the Kindle version. For those watching us, I would recommend get the Kindle version because you can easily browse through. But I lost the page where I read that I think it was a nurse saying that 95% of death is not that bad, the transition. It's not as bad as people think. So, yeah, would you like to make a comment about this?
Yeah. I think that what I heard, and again, I'm not an expert, I'm not a medical, professional, but when I talk to people, what I heard is it's kind of like giving birth. If anyone's ever been in a birthing room, I mean, honestly, there are periods of giving birth that are really hard. And I think time has that. I don't want to sugarcoat it, but for some people, it is really difficult. And then there is like a breakthrough point that seems to happen as people really get closer to the end. And so, really for many people, and also thank God there's morphine and there are meds, but when people start seeing loved ones come into the room and it's either, for the skeptical, we could say they start hallucinating. For me, I feel like you're actually crossing dimensions, but it's people seem to be preparing for the transition. They start having dreams. They start seeing loved ones. And, I would really liken it to birth, where there are hard moments. There are for many people, not everyone, but for, a very large percentage, I can't remember the number either, but a large percentage have kind of a breakthrough where they can really ease into the end. And with support, I mean, I think it becomes easier when they're surrounded by people who see death like birth rather than something else. And if anyone's ever been around a birthing woman, it's, at moments it seems very scary, but actually something very amazing and beautiful is happening. So that's the best I can do in answering that question. Yeah.
And I have two major questions. One is about the current pandemic. I know it's still fresh, we're still living it. But since you've been researching on this, and there's a lot of death going on, and people dying in hospitals without loved ones, etc., have you come across anybody who is potentially researching or paying attention to how this is happening? Talking about this last conversation, some of them are using their devices to communicate with loved ones before they transition. We have news here and there popping up, isolated cases, But have you come across anything that talks about the last conversations in this current pandemic?
Such a great question. And, I haven't, and I think I have to admit that, like many people, I've been very queasy about stepping into, it's such a sacred, sacred time anyway, and so private. But then right now, it's just, there's even another layer of fear around it. But I think your question is brilliant, because we're going to have these things recorded now. And I think the other thing too is because I don't know enough about it medically, but I'm thinking that because breath is so involved, I don't know how much people's communications are affected by their inability to really have any breath independent. But I don't know if that's affected things. It's a great question. I'm sure there's a lot of documentation going on. Thank you for that.
It's so interesting because it ties into something else that I read in your book that matches our studies in Spiritism at Kardec's books, because he says in the book Heaven and Hell, there is a chapter in part 2 that talks about the passing. And he says that you are going to do this crossover, and however you lived your life is going to affect the position. There is a moment in your book, you talk about it in the language, identify the element of however you lived and how you communicate that you're hearing of death, right?
I think so. I think there are exceptions because we are physical beings. And so if if something physical happened, it can shift that. But I think generally we do die the way we live. And, I remember my father was a psychologist, and he was always reflecting on things. And that was a gift I got from him, obviously. But I remember walking to his room about 5 days before he died. And I said, "How you doing, Daddy? How you doing?" He said, "I'm working on myself. I'm working on myself." And like, what a beautiful thing 5 days before dying. But he was very introspective, and he was very aware of his own process. He said to me, to his secretary when she called on the phone, "Alice, this is very interesting. I've never done this before." Right? So he went into the whole death and dying process with the same sense of introspection and kind of curiosity about his process. And so I think, if we live life, Raymond talks a lot about the importance of living life philosophically because it prepares you for death. And I think the more we can look at our lives and what's difficult in our lives with this sense of curiosity and wonder, the closer we get to God. If we assume that everything that God creates or everything that's created is part of God's work for whatever reasons. And I think it's the same thing if we can live our lives with a sense of wonder and curiosity and imagine bringing that to our dying. I book coach. I help people write books. I'm a book coach is one of the ways I make a living, which is really a blast. And I love what I do. And one of my clients is a doctor who got a brain tumor. And she was also a meditator for many, 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 many years. And she had both the ability as a doctor to know what was going on with her body. She knew from the inside out, but she also had the ability as a meditator to sort of step outside herself and have kind of a meta perspective that people always explain when they talk about near-death experiences. They leave their body and they can see everything, right? And, as a physician, one of the things she talked about is she recovered from the brain tumor. She really, and part of how she did it was as a meditator, she had the ability to step away from her own suffering and see it from that perspective. So my point is that, if we live in preparation for our dying in a certain way, I think we can go much more gracefully. And that's what I'm aiming for. That's what I'm aiming for.
It's such a delight to talk to you and Dr. Raymond, because you come with this, it's so natural for you to talk about this and to, enter this world of philosophy in life, etc. But nowadays, our society is so splitted. It's like people are always running away from being introspected. They have to turn on in some device or any device. And our children are getting into that. They can't, they go into the car. Can I have your phone? Can I have your tablet? And then my husband and I are like, okay, let's look at nature. That's our tablet now, because they are so used, especially now with the pandemic. They have to be 4 hours in front of a computer. And then when they are out of it, they look for a screen, because that's the world for them now. So it's becoming very interesting how we're going to deal with these things, don't you think?
I do. And, you know, one of the things, it's funny, we've, like everyone, I've had a really tough year. And what made another layer of it tough is my husband walked out on me right before the pandemic. So not only was I in the pandemic, but my partner for 20 years was suddenly not at my side, right? And it was hard. It's been hard. And gratefully, I'm on the other side of it in many ways. But one of the things that I found really has helped is I'm learning how to play piano. All my life, I wanted
Wow.
to play music. Anyway, I'm learning to play piano. And the reason I mention that is, you know, I really feel like the arts have been a really strong healing force for me this year, and been a great way for me to express some of my grief and try to, again, the more we can, you know, I talked a minute ago about how in death, that ability to step back and witness. And I think the arts allow us to do two things at once. They allow us to both witness what's going on, but also express it. And I think the arts, you know, computers cannot do cannot what humans do. So I think that's also part of Words at the Threshold. You know, when you really listen to your loved one's language as they die, it's almost poetic. And having that sensibility is really important.
You're so right. And here we have Rihanna. She's from South Africa. She's also a host of Cardiac Radio. She's wonderful. You know, it's so beautiful because her daughter and her granddaughter, they do programs at Cardiac Radio. She was a listener, and then they became hosts.
Wonderful.
Beautiful programs. And she's a medium as well. She talks about here, we should think and talk to our family about death as much as possible. We should in some way prepare to return to the spirit world and now practice healthy love.
Amen.
So we can accept it more easily, trust in the process and trust the good. But it's so hard, Lisa, because at the end you say, at some point in your book, you say, here are some suggestions for you to use as you courageously and compassionately witness final words. And you give, I won't spoil it because I want you to read. But you can mention a few things if you want about it's so compassionate on your side to also share your observations, your research, your insight, and bring some preparation for all of us and relief to people as well. So. Would you like to mention something about this, the techniques?
Yeah, you know, well, one of the things that I think that there are many incredible mediums and people who have worked with the afterlife. And so that's nothing new that I can bring. But what I can bring is my love for language and my understanding of language. And that the training that I had as a linguist was that all language is valid. You know, I would never go to China and go, oh, they're speaking that weird Chinese. That language is wrong. No, I mean, it's not intelligible to me, but it's still a viable language that millions of people speak, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I can bring as a linguist to the bedside of the dying and to the families is walking there with that sense of curiosity. And again, not only imagine that it's a sacred place that you've entered, but that also that language of all kinds is valid, and to trust that process. Because I've worked with some people who have written down the words of their loved one, and at the time it made no sense. But then 3 months later, it's like, oh my God, it's like daddy knew that I was going to get married. Or, you know, then there's like, it's almost like this mysterious puzzle that becomes clearer with time. And you had mentioned something earlier, and I hadn't thought of this. I hadn't really thought of doing a follow-up book. You know, talking to people who applied some of the stuff from Words of the Threshold, and to hear, I've heard, you know, little by little, but it might be really interesting to go back to more and more people and see what they discovered from their loved ones in those last words, and how my father kept talking about green, 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 green. And then a couple years after he died, I was looking for a place to live when I went to go move to Georgia to be near Raymond Moody, where I did research. And I found my house on Greencrest Drive, and it might have been a complete accident, but it somehow felt, somehow there was a magic in that for me.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's incredible. But for those, how do you make peace based on your research? Sometimes people want closure, but it's like, for example, my mom says, oh, your dad said something on the last day I saw him when he was at the hospital, admitted to the hospital. And I didn't understand, but I thought I was going to see him again. So I just, but now I don't know what he said. So what would you say based on your research? How can the, is there any way to make sense of this, the gap?
That's a great question. I think there are a few ways. One is to talk to other people in the family, because that person may have said something really similar, or sometimes you can do kind of like family forensics of a phrase. I've found for myself, and other people have done that. So that's one way that's kind of down to earth and practical. And then, less practical and more spiritual, is to really go into prayer and pray and ask for some information or to know more. And you obviously know more about this than I do as a medium, but what I've discovered is sometimes the communications come in images and feelings versus words, and to be open to that. But I would do a forensics, to have others in the family, and you might want to get a piece of paper and get some crayons or something, and just draw your sense of what your loved one was trying to say, and trust that. Just trust what comes out, and just see what emerges, because you might be surprised what you discover. And then, and if nothing comes, and sadly, there are just times that part of love is letting go, and sometimes that's what we have to do. And I know how hard it is.
It is hard. And it's interesting because in one of the items of this list of suggestions, you say, be a student of the language.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how is it?
And so, if your mother, I hate to have any regret, but anytime your loved one says something that baffles you, ask them right then, so you never have to have a sense of regret, and see if you can clarification right there. And part of being a student of the language is keeping your ears and heart open. For the research, people would have a journal at their loved one's bedside, and no matter who was keeping vigil, whoever was in the room, they would write down what they heard, and so they had a running document. And so that way, if everyone's keeping track, in the end, everyone sort of has a more complete record of what the person said.
I want to show you something, because you mentioned about art. It's so interesting you mentioned about art, because I'm not an artist. I'm not, and, I'm a scientist, psychologist, but I love the arts too. And when I saw that I couldn't go visit my parents, and I had to be online with them, and my father was not able to, he didn't want to talk about things, but I see what's coming. I did exactly what you said, pray. And I started drawing. And this is one of the things that I drew for him.
Oh, it's beautiful. Oh my God.
And I wrote in Portuguese, of course, Daddy, I know that the love of God takes care of you. The healing is certain.
Wow.
So I couldn't, because you said, I had to deal with it. And I asked, what do I do? So the mentor said, draw. And then I recorded messages, I recorded poems, and I drew these things for him and my mom. And I said, I know it's okay. I want you to be okay, but I couldn't say it right that way because he didn't want. So you say, be a student of the language, and I understood. He didn't want to talk about death. He didn't want to, and I had to respect. but I could talk about it in another way, right?
Exactly. And I love doing the art because I have some beliefs about that, but I really believe oftentimes spirit is communicating to us in different ways than literal language. And I believe on some level your father received that. I really do receive that beautiful picture. I don't know how it all works, but that's my experience, that there's some connection, especially the more we tap into the universal symbols and the more we do our spiritual work, the more the art that emerges from us is going to be tapped into what I call the field, right? The spiritual field. But and in terms of people may not, someone who's dying may not experience themselves as dying, right? It might be something else. So we may not want to use the word death, but we might want to ask them, what are you experiencing right now? What's going on for you? So that you don't have to use the word death to step into their universe and see what's going on with them. I don't know if I'd want to hear the word death as I'm dying.
It's like when you're traveling. For example, sometimes I compare death to graduation. To some people, leave graduation because they excelled, and they're like, okay, they did great. Like a few days ago, a friend from Brazil, who's a wonderful spiritist, he did so much good. He discarnated of the COVID, but he left so much love, a legacy, that, I said to my friends, he graduated. But, when I go back to graduations and I see my students like, oh, I'm so sorry, we're not going to see each other again. It's almost like you're happy that you are going to another level, but we're not going to be here anymore. So there is this bittersweet feeling sometimes, right?
Right. We have bodies, right? We have bodies. And, one of the things I've been writing about a lot is we have our human story. And then, I love that. I just saw to write.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you for that. That's beautiful. But, we're humans and we have our human story and then we have our soul story, and they're different. Being human is hard. It's hard for me, at least.
It's hard to let go, right? I think it's the detachment, like letting go, renewing ourselves. Like my grandmother the other day, she said, it's hard when your partner dies because you've been with your partner for so long. But in your case, Grandma, it works, not for all of us, because we haven't been with the same partner the whole life. But if that's your case, I believe you. But it varies from person to person. We can't say this is the hardest because it varies, of our attachments, right?
Right. I mean, and if you're a mother and you have 2 young kids and you've only been married 10 years, I mean, that's
my case.
Okay.
I have a kid, 10 years together. It's like I told her, my child goes away now, it's going to hurt much more. I tell you that.
Yeah.
For sure. But you can't, but it's the letting go, learning to let go. But I have a question that is not so easy to talk about, but I think for people who are watching us, it's important to talk about the most difficult cases. What are the most difficult cases you've come across in terms of getting to know what people say when they see the nearing of death?
Just, I'm scared. I don't want to go. A mother asking her children to hold her. I mean, there are, and it is. I mean, it is less. I have less samples of. I mean, more often people are seeing amazing things, but not. No, I mean, there are people who are saying mostly it's just expressing fear, and that's the main thing. I don't hear anything like, "Oh, I'm going to hell," or that kind of, everything we know from near-death experiences, a really very, very, very small percentage, about 3%, report any kind of idea of hell. But it's more just that people, are afraid. And that's, I just, the samples I have are just, hold me, I'm scared. Where's the light? Things are darkening. Yeah. And again, it's a much smaller percentage, but it also could be, quite honestly, that people don't share those as much with me, right? Everybody wants to share the good story. So, again, if I were to be on my deathbed tonight, as much as I'm philosophical, I know this, I've had, like all of us, a hard year this year, but I love being alive. I love being in a body. I love my life. I'm not going to give it up easily.
Good, right? Kardec talks about it. This fear and this non-willingness to die is positive because we fight for life and we're supposed to.
Right.
We're not supposed to surrender, say, oh yeah, I want to die, because that's going to the other side, like the death impulse inside of us. So it's healthy to say, I want to live.
Yeah, I do. And I think what happens for people who are fortunate enough, and that's many, and that as they're dying, they'll start having dreams or visitations from other ones. There's like a process that goes on that makes it easier to let go. But sometimes people don't have those kinds of tools or, experiences.
And here we have John DeRosa. Lisa, John DeRosa is a member of the Spirit Side of Virginia. He's also a host at Kardec Radio, a good friend. And he is this wonderful person who is not afraid of talking about it to the whole family. And the family's like, can you please stop now? And he's the one sharing the good news that life goes on. And here comes, he's quoting you. Lisa's comment about living our lives in preparation for death encapsulates our motto of wanting to continue working and learning until we die. And that's his motto, I tell you that. He is wonderful. And for those who are here, I just want to say, give them a reference. I know we can find your book at Amazon, but would you like to give your website as well, the Smart Coaching website?
It's, I'm sorry, thank you. Finalwordsproject.org, Final Words Project, and there's a lot of information there, as well as a free chapter if people would like to see that. But yeah, finalwordsproject.org, and then Raymond and I have the website lifeafterlife.com also.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So that's the website where people can contact you and talk with you and get to know more about the whole project, right?
Right, and I have a form where people could submit their stories. So if people want to share their accounts.
I really hope somebody does the research regarding the COVID patients.
Oh man, yeah. It's a great
idea. It's difficult, it's hard, but it's needed to understand more about what you've started investigating. At the end of the day, would you say it's healing? Is it healing?
Yeah, this has been incredible the last 7 years. I've heard from families who kept a record that it was healing for them. And then for me personally, I've collected over 2,000 utterances from people even around the world now, and it's been completely healing for me. I've been so grateful, and to work with Dr. Moody has been just, in itself a blessing. Yeah.
And I want to say this: do you ever do any therapeutic approach to families who need to, closure? Talking about, no.
I haven't done that, and it's at one time.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful idea. I mean, at one point I thought that my work might evolve that way, but it just that hasn't happened organically.
Yeah, I'm asking you this because in our center, when people discarnate, sometimes they come back and the family members are like, oh, Vanessa, but she wanted to be cremated and she wasn't cremated, or the reverse. What do you do? And I know she spoke to this person about this and about that. And people are still, a year later, 2 years later, they're still lingering, and they didn't close the chapter regarding the final moments of that person and the way they died, etc.
Wow.
So, right? To make sense of that.
It's so important. It's so important. Yeah, well, I'm open to it. So if anyone wants to contact me through the Final Words Project, anything that I can do to be of service and to help,
Lisa, I have to say, we're delighted to have your book.
Oh,
Thank God you wrote it.
thank you.
Words at the Threshold. Thank you.
No, thank
And
you.
we wish you continue this beautiful works you're doing. And
Thank
know that we are here now. We are your audience as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to have to research Kardec right now when I get home.
Oh, I can easily send you the books, and I'm sure you're going to find so much because he was the codifier. So there you go. You're in the group, the codifier group.
That's beautiful. I love it. Beautiful.
All right. So
All right.
I would like to hear your final comments for those who are here watching us before we wrap up.
Well, first of all, I just want everyone to stay safe and be well. Of course, my heart goes out again to everyone. And also just don't be afraid of any kind of language. Be open to any words you hear and just let your heart be open to the possibilities of what some of the language might mean. That's my main message. Yeah.
Thank you. You know, I make Brianna's my words. Yes, this is already helping people. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
It's an honor and a
I
pleasure.
will stay in touch with you. We wish you a beautiful holiday season, a wonderful new beginning 2021. After all, it's a new decade.
Amen.
All right.
Thank
We
you.
look forward to more of your works. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So, friends, remember, there is so much for us to know. There is so much. Read the book, Words at the Threshold. I have here my Kindle version, and it's a delight. You know, here's the book. Beautiful. You can highlight, you can go back and forth and talk to your loved ones. You see, you're not going to kill anybody. This is one of the best parts of the book. One of the best. There are many. You're not going to kill anybody who is dying by talking about death. And this is good to know because nobody taught us that in school, right? But here with the book, we're educating ourselves. There's so much to learn, and everything we're seeing is about making it natural. Death is part of life. I keep telling Virginia, she's 7, saying, Virginia, oh, the squirrel died, Mom, I'm so sad. I said, but the squirrel didn't die, it's just the body. The body is going to recycle. Nothing is lost in nature. Making this easy, the transition, so natural. It doesn't mean we're not going to love, that we're going to forget. On the contrary, we keep the bonds of love. It's about love at the end of the day. So, friends, there's so much for us to learn. Lisa Smartt was here with us, and we had a blast. Go to her website, finalwordsproject.org. What a beautiful project, so meaningful at this time of COVID-19. 2 days ago, a friend of mine who was 24 days in a hospital because of COVID, he was in Brazil. I couldn't be there. I got to know recently he discarnated. But his family had no regrets. Why? Because they were used to talking about it. Let's do the same. Let's research, read a book, and see how we can make this conversation more natural so we're going to seal another chapter, a chapter of our lives, and allow our loved ones to transition with peace. And when our time comes, let's do the same with one another. Shall we, friends? All right, we wish you lots of blessings and stay tuned at Kardec Radio because today there is more for us to nourish our souls. Thank you, friends.